Good day, everybody, and welcome to another edition of the Military and Foreign Affairs Network. I am your host, the voice of reason. Today we are continuing our ongoing coverage of the war between the Russian Federation and Ukraine. Now today I want to start off and I want to talk about the Western media. I want to talk about the state of affairs in the ongoing war reporting that is occurring here in the United States and even in Western Europe, but namely here in the United States. So if you're watching the news here in the U.S., and that really runs the gambit, any mainstream news outlet, NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, CNN, they seem to have taken this position that the Ukrainian military, the Ukrainian armed forces, is going to absolutely defeat the Russian military. And again, that position is the eventual reclaiming of all of the Donbass to include the Crimea. That seems to be the position of U.S. media. The media here in the United States, and it becomes more or less apparent depending on the news source that you're watching, is touting the U.S. Pentagon government line in terms of whatever the U.S. government is saying. The media is then parroting that information. It is affirming, whether it's true or not, what is happening on the ground. Now, here's the problem with that. Journalism, the media here in the United States, was really designed to be another arm, you could say, of the government, in that it maybe not necessarily an arm of government, but it serves as a check and balance and ultimately the arbiter of truth of what's happening on the ground. So if, for instance, the Pentagon, the Department of Defense, reports something that is maybe a false narrative, maybe it assists the political apparatus of the political party in charge, then the media is supposed to identify that through investigative journalism and then offer a counterclaim. Now, recently, those documents, those hundreds of documents that were released by the 21-year-old $13 an hour Airmen, are being completely, really disregarded. It is more about the fact that that airman allegedly is a traitor to the United States. None of the media outlets are looking at the information that was leaked in terms of, okay, well, we're hearing this from the Department of Defense, but this information that's being released apparently is a little different than what we're being told. For instance, U.S. Special Operations Forces on the ground in Ukraine. North Atlantic Treaty Organization Special Operations Forces from a variety of countries on the ground, quite possibly participating in combat against Russian forces. So it's interesting that at one point in American history, the American media would be clamoring for that information. And what's even more disconcerting is apparently several news outlets that are in the inner circle of the Democrat Party quite possibly already had that information. Meaning that information that was leaked, which is no longer classified, but they're gonna throw that kid in jail, or try to throw him in jail the rest of his life. When individuals in the Washington Post, CNN, probably already had that information. So why did they not want to let that information out? Why does the Washington Post, why does CNN, especially these media organizations that gravitate more towards the Democratic Party, why do they not want that information out? Well, it contradicts their narrative that the Ukrainians are winning the war and the Russians are being defeated and will in all probability be eventually driven out of the Donbass, and the Crimean Peninsula will be retaken by Ukrainian forces. That's what CNN, that's what the Washington Post wants you, the American viewer, to believe. Now, the problem with that, it's simply not true. Now, have the Ukrainians experienced success? Yes, absolutely. I've talked about that. If we look at the start of the conflict, going into the conflict, the talking heads at the Pentagon, even the higher command elements, Joint Chiefs of Staff over at the Pentagon, were stating that the Russians would be in Kiev in a matter of days. This would last days. And they were wrong. Completely wrong on that. They were wrong about Syria. They've been wrong about a multitude of things. They were wrong about Afghanistan. They are wrong when they get up and they say that a man can have a baby. I had to throw that in there, but it's part of the equation where me, the voice of reason, has to sit back and say, wait a minute, I don't agree with what you're saying, and I have to second guess what you're saying. I'm not buying this. And that's what's happening in the course of this conflict. Yes, the Ukrainians have experienced a much greater degree of success than anybody would have believed possible kind of going into this conflict. But the problem is wars ultimately are not measured on tactical battlefield wins. Wars can last years. Wars is about industry. It's about resources. It is about mobilization. And that document leak indicates things are not going as hoped for. With the amount of intelligence the U.S. is providing, the amount of money the U.S. is providing, the amount of weapon systems the U.S. is providing to the Ukrainians. And not only that, obviously the direct use of U.S. military forces inside of Ukraine. I've talked about before that I believe that F-22s, F-35s, or some other classified stealth asset is being used over eastern Ukraine, central Ukraine, to monitor and report what the Russians are doing, where they're at, and then allowing Ukrainian long-range fire systems to engage those targets. Yes, those systems are having an impact in certain areas of the conflict zone, and obviously it's an issue that I don't believe the Russians were completely prepared for. If you look at the initial operation that took place towards Kiev, that Russian force that moved in column towards its objectives over roadways did not appear to be a force that was prepared for the type of resistance that it met. Now, the Russians are adapting, and we're seeing that on the ground now. We're seeing traditional Russian doctrine being used to great effect in this ongoing conflict, especially Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and other areas. Again, we're not seeing maneuver operations. We're seeing fix and destroy operations. We're seeing the deep battle strategy of the Russian military being used against the Ukrainians. Now, how does that manifest itself on the battlefield? Well, you hear it. You hear anecdotal reports on how that deep battle strategy is manifesting itself on the battlefield. You have Ukrainian lieutenants, Ukrainian NCOs, Ukrainian privates talking about the lack of ammunition. The fact that they're allowed to fire up to 10 rounds of artillery per day at Russian forces. That there is a lack of ammunition. And that lack of ammunition is because the Russians are targeting and going after those supply depots throughout Ukraine. And what's keeping the Ukrainian military alive right now, essentially, is the inflow of munitions and ammunitions from Western Europe. That's just fact. So, again, we continue to watch the situation in Bakhmut. We continue to watch the situation in Avdiivka. Again, as we look at what's happening around Avdiivka, if we look at Bakhmut, it looks very similar in terms of the operational area, the battlescape. You have essentially the Russians creating pockets in which large numbers of Ukrainian forces are being funneled to defend these areas which the leadership in Kiev seem very keen to want to keep hold of. Now, obviously, the Ukrainians can't withdraw in perpetuity, but they do have the ability to pick and choose their fights, and I don't believe that what's happening in Bakhmut is especially beneficial to the Ukrainian military. I think ultimately they're going to be unsuccessful, and ultimately the Russians are going to seize control of Bakhmut. In all probability, they're going to encircle, take control of Avdiivka as well. Now, we're hearing talk from the Ukrainian side about reports that Russian forces are packing up items of value in the Kherson Oblast, south of Zaporizhia, and what could be a sign that the Russians are preparing for some sort of tactical withdrawal. And I wanted to have a look at that. I wanted to talk about that. So if we take that as something that could be occurring, where are the Russians going to go? Again, they could withdraw further south towards Melitopol, towards Mariupol. But the problem with that is going to put Ukrainian long-range artillery systems eventually, squarely, have the ability to attack these areas. So I don't think that is realistic, that the Russians are looking for some sort of goodwill, tactical withdrawal, as the Ukrainians call it, which ultimately the Ukrainians believe it's a capitulation because the Russians, can't hold this line running just south of Zaporizhia to the eastern Donbass. At this point, again, the Russians pull further south, it's going to make the strategic conundrum for the Russians that much worse. So again, I doubt that holds any validity. I don't believe the Russians are looking to pack up and pull south. I don't believe the Russians at this point have any intent of giving up the land corridor from Russia to Crimea. Don't think that's going to happen. I mean, ultimately, that would be a complete or almost complete defeat for the Russian military. And given the amount of equipment, the amount of personnel that has been expended in this operation, I still believe that the Russian war goal, war aim, is all territory east of the Dnieper River. It will be very interesting to see what happens once summer arrives, once late summer arrives. That will give us a better idea on the Russian preparations, the Russian mobilization that have occurred, and it'll give us a better idea on what the Russian intent is. Right now, I believe it is a hold followed by a win strategy. Yes, they are rebuilding, they are mobilizing, they are getting their military-industrial complex, the Russians, on a wartime footing. And I don't believe that the Russians have met all their war goals or war aims in this current conflict. I definitely believe that Kharkiv, however you would like to pronounce it, is and has been a Russian objective. I believe that obviously Sloviansk, Kramatorsk are current Russian objectives. Again, and then in all likelihood, all areas east of the Dnieper River are Russian objectives, and quite possibly the Russians still have eyes on Kiev as well. Again, there wasn't even an Easter ceasefire. These two sides are in no way ready to talk. There has been a lot of damage that has been done to the relationship between Ukraine, the West, and Russia. And I believe right now that Russia's goal is to win this. And what concerns me the most is ultimately the Russian relationship with China. I believe now that the leadership in the Kremlin has a score to settle with the United States. And that score that the Russians are looking to settle with the United States, possibly other Western European countries, is not ultimately victory in the Donbass, is not ultimately victory in Ukraine. It could be something else, something that is not on the radar screen right now. And again, you have to look at that continuing relationship that is getting closer and closer between China and Russia. If we were to go back to the 1960s, 1970s, and we would have observed, us here in the United States during the Cold War, a military alliance between China and Russia, China and the Soviet Union, that would have U.S. planners incredibly concerned. And again, we are in the same, we are in a much more graver situation right now, given the rise of China. China is, in all probability, well, not all probability, they are the second greatest military power on the planet right now. United States, maybe, and then China. Now, obviously, I do have some concerns about some cultural issues here in the United States that could be degrading the American ability to wage war. And we're not seeing that take place in China. We're not seeing that take place in Russia. And when these two states, the largest nation state in terms of landmass, with massive amounts of resources, merging with the most populous country on the planet, with tremendous manufacturing capability, Russia, China, military alliance, that should be concerning. And I'm not sure the U.S. is looking at the big picture. It's not looking at the long-term picture. Because if it was, it would probably have sought a different outcome than what we're seeing right now in Ukraine. Is Ukraine worth the alliance of Russia and China against the United States? You answer that question. You be the judge of that. Is the cost versus benefit of a Russian-Chinese alliance, military alliance against the United States, worth the borderlands? You tell me. Have a good day.